Okay, now we're going to look at the principles of legitimate cooperation. And basically what these principles have to do with is how close you are to a moral action and how responsible you are for moral evil should it result. So the first type of cooperation with the moral action is formal cooperation. And the first type of formal cooperation is basically just doing the immoral action. If you're freely committing an immoral action, then you are responsible for the immoral action. It goes back to our concept of mortal sin. Remember, if somebody does something that is gravely wrong with informed consent of the will and with full knowledge that they're doing something wrong, then they're morally responsible for it. Okay? But you might notice there's something else here, right? Another form of formal cooperation is if you give someone advice or assistance in committing an immoral act. So, for example, if you've somebody who's on the corner dealing drugs is freely committing an immoral act, that's formal cooperation. But what if he's got another drug dealer friend who tells him that there's this particular corner that would be really good for him to go deal on, or helps him set up his meth lab? Well, in that case, you're giving somebody an advice or assistance in committing the immoral act, and that friend is in part morally responsible for what the person did. We see this in our legal system even. I mean, if you look at something like murder and accessory to murder. So if somebody murders someone, they're freely committing an immoral act. If somebody's an accessory to murder, then they're giving advice or assistance on how to commit the immoral act. So for example, if somebody is planning on murdering someone, and then they go to a friend and disclose this, and the friend tells them, okay, here's how you do it, that's accessory. If somebody's driving a getaway car, or if they're providing the means necessary for that murder to take place, they're an accessory. And so that is formal cooperation, and that person has a moral responsibility. It gets a little fuzzier when we start to think about the next kind of cooperation, which is material cooperation. And material cooperation basically says, look, I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't agree with your immoral intention, but I'm going to cooperate with the act in some way. This is the one that comes up all the time in medical ethics. And it's something that we're having to deal with right now. I mean, think about, for example, the current healthcare law and all of the issues that are surrounding that contraception mandate in the healthcare law. And the idea is, should Catholic hospitals be required to provide contraception as well as sterilization surgeries like vasectomies and tubal ligations, even though it goes against their explicitly stated moral beliefs? If they were actually going against those beliefs themselves, and willing to do it, then that's a moral problem. But the issue here is these Catholic hospitals don't want to do this, but they're being forced to do it by cooperating with a system that forces them to do it. And in a sense, this is material cooperation. Because material cooperation is when an individual or a group does not agree with the immoral intention, but they somehow cooperate with that act. So, and this is the moral issue that the Catholic hospitals are frankly struggling with right now, because they're going to be forced by the Department of Health and Human Services to provide tubal ligations, vasectomies, etc., even though those surgeries are morally impermissible according to Catholic doctrine. So the question is, how responsible are they? And we make some distinctions in theology between both immediate and mediate material cooperation, and then proximate and remote material cooperation. So, immediate material cooperation is when you can't perform the act without my help. So I don't agree with what you're doing, but I give you something that's absolutely necessary for you to perform that act, and you couldn't do it if I wasn't there. Mediate cooperation is assistance in a slightly less direct way. So it's not necessarily that you can't perform the act without my help, but I'm still helping you to perform the act. The example that your book gives is nurses in an abortion clinic. The doctor that's performing the abortion is performing a formal cooperation with an intrinsic evil. But when you look at the nurses could be morally against abortion on their own, personal level, and they wouldn't be willing to do it themselves, but, they've got the job at the hospital that's providing these things. Now, the nurse that's directly involved, that's handing the tools to the doctor, that nurse is immediate. You can't perform the act without that nurse's help. Then it gives the anesthesiologist example for immediate, where it says that the anesthesiologist that puts the patient under in order for this immoral thing to happen, that anesthesiologist is assisting, but is assisting in a slightly less direct way. Maybe you could find another anesthesiologist, or put the patient under in another way. And then the question is just how proximate or remote are you from the action? In those first two cases, both people are proximate to the action, which means they're close to it. So the anesthesiologist and the nurse that's performing, that's handing the instruments, are both near the action, and they're both directly involved. But then there are some people who aren't really directly involved at all. What about the janitor who's sweeping the floors, right? That janitor basically is just working here because he's got a family to support, and he's sweeping the floors even though he knows that something immoral might be going on here. He's not actively taking part in that immoral thing. Okay? So that's remote cooperation. Basically, your moral responsibility for the action decreases as we get further and further away from that total formal cooperation. You're still somewhat morally responsible with immediate and mediate material cooperation. But once we get to that remote material cooperation, it gets a little fuzzier, right? If that janitor couldn't find a job other than to provide the cleaning services for this place that's doing this immoral thing, it's probably still okay for him to work there. Okay? Then we've got the question of scandal. And the sin of scandal is basically doing something, and by your doing something, showing other people that doing that thing is morally okay. So if you're, for that janitor, by working at that abortion clinic, that janitor is in essence saying, at least implicitly, that he supports what's going on there. Even if the janitor may not explicitly support it. And so when people see him working there, they think, okay, it's not so bad. And that could be part of that sin of scandal. All right, so these forms of cooperation are basically ways to judge how close you are to the action and how morally responsible you are for it. And I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples of each of these kinds of cooperation, which is what you're going to do in the question for tomorrow.